very much, everyone, for joining this panel discussion today. And I hope you're feeling invigorated and not too sleepy after lunch. So today we are going to be talking about having a quite insightful and innovative discussion around looking at using market-based practices and principles to address some root cause challenges and solutions to ethical recruitment problems in global supply chains. So just before we begin, some brief housekeeping points. If your mic is red like this, you are on a hot mic, so please don't speak. There will be time for Q&A at the end. If you do have a question, I would ask, please, that you activate your mic to ask your question so that the participants online can hear. As well, during the session, if you have any questions, please scan the QR code up on the screen behind you so that you can submit questions live during the session as well. And we'll be monitoring those and taking some feedback. So without any further ado, I would like to formally begin today's session. So international migrant workers are a key driver of the global economy, as many of us in this room very well know. According to the IOM, international migrant workers sent in excess of $831 million in remittances globally in 2022. And in Asia, that dynamic is even more pronounced. Asia is home to 40% of the world's migrants, of whom half migrate internally within Asia. And especially here in Thailand, that dynamic is especially felt with migrant workers from Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, as well as elsewhere, forming the backbone of Thailand's manufacturing and supply chain-based economy. Some around 10% of Thailand's workforce, depending on how you count it, consists of migrant workers, and obviously they are much more heavily represented in industries such as seafood and manufacturing. And so it's no surprise that for the last decade, business efforts to look at addressing human rights risks in supply chains have focused quite heavily on issues relating to ethical recruitment, as well as forced labor indicators associated with migrant workers, such as debt bondage, passport retention, deceptive recruitment practices, and abusive working conditions. However, despite many of these efforts and significant efforts and investments that have been made by governments, brands, suppliers, and civil society, many of these problems continue to persist. Just to give one example, in Malaysia alone, public commitments from companies to reimburse recruitment fees to migrant workers exceed $120 million US. And yet, those commitments and those efforts to remediate recruitment fees pale in significance to the profits that exist and that can be extracted from the exploitation of migrant workers and the recruitment market. According to the IOM, around 15% of illicit profits generated through the exploitation of migrant workers globally are represented by recruitment fees and related costs and other unlawful fees and charges in the amount of an estimated $5.6 billion. And so, with all of these challenges that are now being faced in our supply chains, increasing supply chain disruptions, geopolitical uncertainty, disruptions to migration flows caused by conflicts and climate change, the need to find scalable and sustainable solutions to solving responsible recruitment challenges is more important than ever. And so how then can we think about trying to unpack this complex puzzle and look at ethical recruitment from not just a human rights and social compliance or legal perspective, but understanding ethical recruitment as really being an issue of supply and demand, an economic challenge, as well as a legal, moral, and human rights challenge. And so the Ethical Recruitment Marketplace is a market-based initiative led by the world's leading consumer brands, working together through the Consumer Goods Forum that aims to take a market-based lens to tackle some of these challenges. The vision of the Ethical Recruitment Marketplace is that ethical recruitment becomes the norm, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's commercially
Recording
viable.
in progress.
It's commercially viable and good for business too. Its mission is to enable an end-to-end recruitment marketplace that brings together a commercially sustainable ecosystem of actors working end-to-end in the recruitment supply chain to embed respect for workers' rights and ethical recruitment at its core. And our emphasis on the end-to-end approach really signifies a holistic approach that recognizes that no one actor and no one single intervention within the labor supply chain can really solve this issue. So the marketplace aims to address the economic drivers of exploitative recruitment at the root cause level. Because in order to make ethical recruitment the norm, it needs to be commercially viable and financially sustainable for all actors involved in the labor supply chain. So that includes workers, labor providers, employers, and brands, all collectively and collaboratively addressing supply and demand factors that increase vulnerabilities to exploitative recruitment. It also means that in order to become established, ethical recruitment needs to not just be competitive with traditional recruitment models. It actually needs to be more profitable than recruitment models to encourage more labor providers, more employers to operate on an ethical basis. It also recognizes that brands alone cannot solve this problem. In order for ethical recruitment to be the norm, it's necessary for there to be the enabling policy conditions to allow ethical operators in the supply chain to compete fairly and effectively with other market actors. Finally, taking ethical recruitment as an economic question also requires us to question and challenge our existing business practices. What are the existing incentives and barriers that exist within our current purchasing, sourcing, and supply chain practices that incentivize exploitative recruitment practice, either advertently or inadvertently, through the unintended consequences of potentially well-meaning actions, such as things like social compliance audit programs, recruitment fee remediation, or other activities. So these are some of the themes that we're hoping to discuss on today's panel. Before I introduce today's panel, and while I'm introducing them, I have a quick scene-setting poll up on the slide, if you'd care to share some feedback and thoughts, and we'll reflect on those during and at the end of the discussion. So first on my right is Rachel Elliott. She is the General Manager for Human Rights for the Woolworths Group, Australia and New Zealand's largest retailer, working across businesses to drive positive impact through the power of partnerships, insights, and advocacy. Under Rachel's leadership, the Woolworths Group's Human Rights Program has been ranked as the top global program globally in the recent Know the Chain Food and Beverage benchmark. Rachel is also the co-chair of the Consumer Goods Forum's Human Rights Coalition, as well as a member of the federal government's Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group. Next on my right is Arti Kapoor, who is the founder and executive director of Embed, an independent consultancy focusing on business and human rights and social protection. Arti has over 30 years of professional experience, including 25 years working on human rights issues, with a focus on forced labor, trafficking, and fighting child exploitation. She's a qualified lawyer in the UK and in the US, as well as a trained organizational analyst, and her experience spans leadership positions in the UK and Southeast Asia across governments, NGOs, corporate agencies, as well as assignments in Eastern Europe and Africa. To my left is Catherine Parsons, a senior advisor at Walk Free, an international human rights group working to accelerate the end of modern slavery. She leads Walk Free's advocacy work for stronger corporate accountability standards in Australia, Asia, and Europe. She also leads its work as the Secretariat for the Bali Process, Government and Business Forum. Catherine previously worked for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and was posted to New Delhi and Jakarta, and she holds a Master's of International Law and a BA in Journalism. And so, with that, I would like to open the panel discussion by first turning to Rachel to share, from your perspective, what have been some of the drivers that have led to the development of the marketplace concept, and what are some of its core pillars? And also, why at Woolworths have you felt that this collective brand action is necessary in order to tackle some of the root causes of exploitative recruitment at scale?
Yeah, thank you, Noan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the room and anyone who is online. Super quick context about Woolworths Group. As Noan said, Woolworths Group is the largest retailer in Australia and New Zealand. We're also the largest private sector employer in Australia. But like any global retailer, we have a very big, complex, globally connected supply chain, which is certainly not without challenge. The marketplace that we're talking to you about today is essentially the culmination of about 4 years worth of learnings and experiences from Woolworths Group And really it started for us in about 2022 when we identified our first case of modern slavery in our supply chain with a supplier based in Malaysia. Australia has the Modern Slavery Reporting Act, and under that act we became the first company in Australia to report a case of modern slavery in our supply chain. This kicked off a very, very large piece of work for us. We worked with this particular supplier for about 2 years just in order to remediate the situation. Really pleasingly, about 2 years later, we were able to disclose in our modern slavery statement that we had remediated for around 98% of workers. But almost alarmingly, what we found over this really extended 2-year period was the more we identified, the more we remediated, actually the more we found as well. It's very deep, very complex issues, and remediation is just not enough. So we were very keen to try to introduce projects and pilots and streams of work that really got to the grassroots drivers of what had actually happened in our supply chain to really try to prevent anything like this happening again. A very bold and ambitious ambition in itself. But we worked really hard, not just with this particular supplier, but every single one of our suppliers starting in Malaysia in a one-on-one capacity building perspective. We worked with our suppliers to put in place the policies, the practices, to look at the due diligence that they were conducting, to give them the tools and the frameworks for how they actually recruited workers into their supply chain. So this particular issue, the case of modern slavery, was really extreme debt bondage, along with around six of the 11 indicators of modern slavery, so it was quite a complex case. But we have worked over the past 4 years with some really, really great external partners. We've worked with On the Level. We conducted what we called our Nepal pilot, which was to look at actually the certification of recruitment agents in our supply chain. We've worked to try to embed worker grievance at scale through our own worker grievance mechanism, but then we've worked with ISRA Institute to try and bring scale to that. Many, many partners, but as I said, the more we found, the more we unraveled more and more issues happening. So it was not just a case of one single thing was the cause of this finding in our supply chain. Based on the 4 years of learnings, what we've really identified is there is no single solution to any of this. There is no singular intervention that is going to solve anything. It's actually the culmination and the collaboration of a whole heap of programs and partners and interventions at every single step of that recruitment journey, starting from brands and buyers all the way down to recruitment agents and workers in sending countries. So it's in our mind at least, moving beyond this idea of the first mile and into more of a 100-mile recruitment journey and looking at the interventions and the opportunities for exploitation at every single one of those levers. So it's a very complex issue, which I don't doubt if it wasn't complex, we would have all solved this already. So this for us initiated in our minds this idea of the marketplace. We, about 2 years ago, took on the role of co-chair with the Consumer Goods Forum because finding modern slavery in our supply chain was a bit of a shock. I think we all know it's out there, but you never really expect to find it in your supply chain. And when it is, obviously, it's very deeply concerning. And there's also no playbook. This is not easy, and there is no singular playbook for how to remediate, how to mitigate, how to put in place all the practices to try and prevent this from happening again. Our learning showed that we are just at the very limit of the ability we have to have impact on our own. So collaboration is absolutely key. I heard it at the first event listening to you this morning, Artie, and I think that is just fundamental. Collaboration is how we can solve this together, but collaboration is how we bring scale. And so the Consumer Goods Forum, as Narwin said, has many, many, many of the global brands. It is CEO-led, which is fabulous because you have that top-down level in endorsement of a principle. So for us, trying to build the marketplace through the CGF, trying to bring scale to basically a virtuous circle of levers through that 100-mile ethical recruitment journey. I think I'm at my limit, so I'm sure we'll get into more and more of this as we go through the rest of the panel, but that's really been what has been the driving force behind the marketplace from a Woolworths perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel. And I think obviously you touched on the need for using multiple levers, engaging multiple actors, and collaborating effectively to solve some of these challenges. So I think, Catherine, from your perspective, having engaged governments and working with policymakers to look at some of these challenges, I guess what are some of your thoughts around how businesses can not just engage with government, but actually collaborate with them to share those learnings and insights to make more effective policy making to address some of these issues?
Thanks. And firstly, I'd just like to say I love hearing Rachel speak, because I think in my experience, a lot of the expectation is that businesses are kind of the bad guys that just want, they're to protect their own bottom line and looking after every dollar. And to actually hear that passion come through in your voice, Rachel, I think is incredibly, not just refreshing, but I think it's just an important voice to hear in the room. But now, in answer to your question, I think you're clearly right. Governments set the rules of the market, but businesses are the ones who are operating in the markets day to day. And so, to me, it's completely crazy that we have situations where they're not talking to each other. If we want this ethical recruitment marketplace in Southeast Asia to succeed, and I think we do, the collaboration can't just be about companies lobbying governments for change and governments issuing directives from the top down. It has to be a two-way exchange of learning. So I do have a few ideas on maybe some practical ways that this could happen. The first is, in my space, in the NGO space, we often talk about co-design, and oftentimes we're talking about co-design with survivors. In this case, I think businesses and governments should be looking to co-design these systems. Governments, we know, they often develop regulations in isolation, but the businesses are the ones who know what actually works in complex supply chains. And so bringing those perspectives together, for example, you could pilot digital job matching platforms or recruitment fee monitoring tools jointly. That would ensure, by working together, the rules are actually enforceable and workable on a practical level. The ethical recruitment, it won't scale if it's just rules on paper. It's going to scale when government and businesses actually write the rule book together. A second area I'd be keen to look at would be data and transparency. Companies hold a lot of data on recruitment costs, on worker feedback, for example, recruiter practices. Governments rarely see this data, and they're super interested in it. So if there were trusted mechanisms to share that data, then that's through anonymised dashboards or industry government working groups, for example. Then the regulators can really calibrate the policies based on real evidence and not just what they think is happening out there in theory. And I guess my final thought would be around joint capacity building. There's a lot of capacity building going on by governments, and there's a lot of capacity building going on by businesses. But I think if you could join forces on, for example, training on compliance and workers' rights. So we know recruiters and employers need this training, but so do labour inspectors and embassy officials, for example. So pooling those resources, creating common training modules, for example, sharing case studies of what works, could ensure consistency across borders. So to me, it's about shifting the mindset, moving from government regulates, business complies, towards that model of shared responsibility. I think ethical recruitment will only scale if governments and businesses are willing to learn from one another and admit where the pain points are and co-create solutions. So if we get that right, we're not just going to reduce risk in supply chains, we'll actually make fair recruitment the default in the region.
Thanks very much, Catherine, for that. And I think, there have been, just to react briefly to that, there have been some, examples of efforts, most recently in Thailand, with disruptions of recruitments from migrant workers from Myanmar and Cambodia, which have led to some quite rapid policy changes to quite long-standing policies around labor recruitment and immigration, partly in response to, business pressure to maintain the supply of migrant labor. Which demonstrates, I think, the importance of migrant workers to many employers and the economy in Thailand, as well as the ability of governments to be responsive and flexible when business presents a unified front to government to advocate for reform. But Arti, your thoughts perhaps maybe on, so we talked a little bit about the how we can engage, but what are your thoughts about what does actually make for effective regulation in the recruitment market to actually incentivize ethical recruitment to thrive and be sustainable?
Thank you. Before I answer that question, I also want to say how important this conversation is. The idea of an ethical recruitment marketplace sounds like something that's kind of a no-brainer, but no one so far has actually been talking about it as a marketplace. We're living in a mostly capitalist world, and in this capitalist world, what makes the world go round? Money. And so when we're bringing a solution, when we're bringing solutions to something that is mainly motivated by hundreds of years of, let's say, globalized trade, political situations, colonialism, freedom, and all of this, we have to look at the historical context of how international labor markets and globalized supply chains have come about. And it's those rules of doing international trade that has resulted in the current situation. So by changing the trade, the way that marketplaces operate, it's kind of a genius question, even though it's a very obvious question. So I'm really excited by this conversation. And then in terms of how government or how laws and legislation can enable good and ethical recruitment, first of all, it starts before the law is even considered. As part of my legal training, I actually did a master's in law and economics, which is all about understanding the jurisprudence. Why do we have laws? Is it to set norms? Is it to set human behavior? Is it to set what's fair? What's the purpose of a law? When I first started looking at responsible recruitment, I led a research, at embed led a research where we were looking at the Nepali situation and the labor corridor into Malaysia. And what I found was that before the 10,000 Nepali rupee fee structure in the regulations, Nepali foreign workers were paying on average about 1 month's salary in recruitment fees. So after being in a job placement for 1 month, they had more or less paid it off. And that was when there was no regulations about this. It was just a set market standard. And then the government brought in the maximum ceiling fee of 10,000 Nepali rupees, which is less than $100. It was unfeasible from a marketplace marketplace perspective. Recruitment agencies were not able to make any money on that, and it had an effect on the market. Do you know what happened? Does anybody know what happened? Was it good or was it bad? Who thinks it was good? Who thinks it was bad? Yeah, a few more hands, exactly. Because the rules were not fit for purpose, the idea of having a 10,000 Nepali rupee ceiling for fees resulted in an underground market. And the underground market went from what was transparently and everybody agreed 1 month's salary, 1 month's equivalent of salary, went up to 6 months' salary for some of the foreign workers. They ended up being worse off. And this is basic law and economics. What is the impact you want to have on the law, with the law? So the first thing is to think about the outcome. If you want everybody to be on board, you have to understand everyone's human behavior. And when we're living in a capitalistic world, it's about how are you going to make money out of this? And one thing I want to just say is maybe the elephant in the room, I'm going to finish, is that, especially for the NGOs, I want to say, is business and profit a bad word? Is it bad to think about profit? Can you accept that businesses have a different mindset and businesses want to do business, they want to make profit, and it should be done ethically? So this is what we're talking about here. So I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Arti. And I think it's important to think about, as we're talking about the law and the economic incentives that creates, I think also brands through their due diligence, sourcing, purchasing, compliance activities also create similar incentives. So perhaps Rachel, but I would invite the other panelists to share their thoughts as well. I think, what do you see as needing to change about the existing way that we are doing our due diligence, our supplier engagement, our purchasing, to actually change the incentive structures we're creating in favor of an ethical recruitment market?
Oh my God, so many ideas. Maybe if I start with maybe some of the really practical elements that we're trying to bring to the marketplace concept and break it down into some of the chunks. I think if you think about it, obviously we're a big retailer. Other big retailers, Tesco, Walmart, Sainsbury's, Kroger, etc., or even our suppliers, brands like Mondelez, Unilever, etc., we all have very similar human rights commitments. We all have very similar human rights programs. But, and I heard it this morning, and this is something that I'm super keen on, we all do it slightly differently. This puts compliance burden into the market. It just does. And it's not intentional. There is, I have rarely met a bad actor who wants to put in place a burden on their supply chain. It is us trying to do our role and not actually thinking of the bigger picture. So I think through the CGF, what we're trying to do is allow ourselves that opportunity to helicopter up for a second, put our head above the parapet, and actually think about it from a brand perspective collaboratively instead of each of us in our singular silo. So over the course of a couple of months ago, actually myself and a colleague from Walmart, we have very similar supply chains. So we went out and did a joint supply chain visit, went out and met some of the suppliers we each work with. And through this visit, we found that not just through our work, but through the many, many other brands that they work with, they spend about 200 days of any year getting themselves ready for audit. That is alarming and should not be happening. But as I said, nobody does that intentionally. But unless we're asking the questions, we don't know that this happens. So I think this is one of the really, hopefully, strategic differences of what we're trying to land with the marketplace through the CGF. If we can start to look at mutual recognition at scale, if we can start to look at harmonization of principles and approaches at scale, so that throughout that supply chain, we're reducing the compliance burden, we're reducing the complexity and actually making it easier for any business to operate. So in my mind, that's one pillar. And I think it could be quite a game changer in terms of changing just how things work in a supply chain. I think, and many of us have talked about it, but responsible purchasing practices is obviously another one of those no-brainers. How do we start to look at frameworks and the tools around ring-fencing labour costing, shared cost modelling, and other things like that? So this is the economic principles and the economic drivers that we're trying to initiate through the marketplace. In my mind, they are the things that brands can do to essentially put their money where their mouth is as a starting point. And if we can start to introduce and implement change like that, I think then generating the support and the goodwill of those further down our supply chain to look at some of the other pillars, whether it's ethical recruitment certification or pathways. I'm very keen on pathways as opposed to purist certification. I don't think, unfortunately, being purist on anything works. The best approach for at least Woolworths tries to take is one of pragmatism. We can aspire to continuous improvement, but pragmatism has to be how we seek to embed anything in a supply chain, and accepting that we're never going to get to perfection. So how do we just continue to build and work together in an iterative process? And then I think other opportunities, just again, back to my first point around we all have similar programs, we all have similar commitments, but we're also doing similar pilots. So many of us are doing a pilot here and a pilot there and a pilot there, but with nothing actually culminating at scale. Again, we're really not having that impact. So through the CGF, by all of us as brands getting together, if we can start to scale the opportunity, the impact hopefully will start to flow from there.
Yeah, I'd love to just add on to that, Rachel. As you know, one of the recommendations that we've been making to the Ethical Marketplace dialogues and workshops is the idea that are brands able to, and I'm not just asking you to speak from Woolworths, but maybe it's another question, but are brands able to accept temporary dilution of ethical recruitment standards? And I'm kind of saying something potentially controversial, because sometimes when I'm having conversations behind closed doors, I present the evidence, sometimes to other NGOs, sometimes to businesses or business associations, and I say, we've spoken to hundreds of migrant workers across Thailand and Malaysia and other countries. When we ask migrant workers what are their top issues, recruitment fees isn't always in the top 5. Sometimes they have more urgent issues they want sorted out. Yet, when we're looking at international standards and conversations on ethical recruitment, so much hangs around recruitment fees, and it's employer pays principle or all or nothing. And sometimes we come between suppliers and buyers, and the suppliers are like, we cannot do employer pays principle. Some of the biggest supply chain businesses in the world have taken up to 6 years to come to employer pays principle because it's so complicated. As Nawin was saying, 40% of migrant worker populations are across APAC. So basically, if we really want to be practical, digestible with actually moving the needle, I agree, incentivization of supplier corporate behavior by brands putting money where your mouth is and saying, right, we're going to pay for better standards. That's supporting the internalization of social costs, and that the markers for higher pricing would be set on a yearly basis. It's iterative. In year 1, you've got to have a policy. On year 2, you've got to start, I'm just making this up as an example. In year 2, suppliers start gathering data of workers' recruitment processes. Year 3, you start reforming your contracting standards and post-arrival orientation. By year 4, you're really getting into the recruitment fees, because by this time suppliers are getting socialized into the idea of paying for recruitment fees, how to do it, how to calculate it, how to work with their supply chain, their recruiters. And so what you're doing is you're very intelligently injecting money for the demand of better, incrementally phased, incremental improvements of ethical recruitment. And so it's not all or nothing. So I guess the question is, to what extent can brands, international NGOs, maybe UN agencies, accept an incremental approach to ethical recruitment? And that means perhaps temporarily accepting that employer pays principle is not realistic in the short term.
Can I just jump in? No, and sorry, Adi, I think that is such a fabulous point, and it actually sort of relates to what you had said in the forum earlier, which I had wanted to comment on. I think one of the really big pieces, the marketplace, one of the guiding principles is progress over perfection. I think this idea that anything is entirely linear is just not fact. We don't see constant improvement, things jump around, and we're going to have to accept that you may take 2 steps back forward and then take 5 steps backward. And we accept that and we just continue to iterate. But I think and this may not be a popular statement, but I think one of the things I would love to see us all collectively move away from, especially from a business perspective, is this idea of the gotcha moment. So you might have identified an issue in a supply chain, you might be working to remediate it. For a Woolworths group, we will always seek to stay. We will seek to do the hard work and actually remediate a situation. We don't expect perfection. But unfortunately, there are some in society who do. And the moment they might identify something that they think they've got you on, there's suddenly a big media campaign. And I just think that we have to accept that level of gotcha moment is not helpful if we want to actually work to change things and actually work to improve the situation for people in the supply chain. We can't create this culture of fear where a business is too scared to be transparent in the work that they're doing, too scared to be transparent in the challenges that are in supply chains. Because I think we all have to accept there are challenges in supply chains. And the less we are able to talk about this, the more it becomes hidden. And then it's a conversation that none of us are happening, and so we are then not changing. And I think that's actually a really key element of this idea of, can we accept something? Potentially we all can if we accept progress over perfection, but we have to accept that we're going to collaborate together. No one is deliberately out there trying to do the wrong thing, or more often than not, no one is trying to do the wrong thing. But let's accept that we're in it together. And no single business, no single actor owns the problem or owns the solution.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rachel and Artie. And I think just to add one brief reaction to that as well, I think two things. One, in terms of wanting to iterate and work towards goals instead of measuring outcomes before we've got the process in place. So your suppliers who have their next upcoming social compliance audit, that they have to show that there are no recruitment fees before their customers have even worked with them or supported them to get the process in place to make sure that that happens, right? And that's what we've been perhaps improperly fixated on and creating the wrong incentives by measuring outcomes before process. And I think the other thing to touch on, you mentioned purchasing practices and working with suppliers, but that also cascades down as well. So something that we've been talking about is the need to also recognize that between suppliers and labor agents, they also have a customer-supplier relationship. And the purchasing practices between suppliers and labor agents are equally as important in rounding out this economic picture as the purchasing practices between brands and suppliers, right? So we talked about that in the last session. So I think, Catherine, was there anything else you wanted to add in terms of, anything else that needs to change or things that you think needs to change about the existing way of working in the ethical recruitment space?
Sure. Sorry, I'll try to be brief, but it's just really fascinating to listen to the three of you, actually, because what I'm hearing is each of you, in your own way, describing cultural shifts, which are massively difficult to achieve. There needs to be a shift in the way business does business. There needs to be a shift in the way society views what business is doing. There needs to be that shift in the way employers think about recruitment fees. You were talking about, Artie, and that is going to take a long time. And I like how you built in that idea of needing nuance as well. I just add one more cultural shift that I can see is needed here, which is the shift actually in the mindset of the workers themselves. Because what I have seen happen on the ground in various countries in Asia that I've visited and talked to people is an expectation that you will have to pay recruitment fees. And just anecdotally, I know I've mentioned this story to a few of you before, but I was in Nepal a couple of years ago and speaking about an entirely different comment, and I made some flippant remark about the employer pays principle and how people should not be paying recruitment fees. And a young man in the audience stood up, and he was university educated and he spoke perfect English. And he said to me, in astonishment, he said, "Are you telling me I should not have to pay to get a job?" I said, "That's absolutely what I'm telling you." And he said, "Can you give me an example of a country where this is the case?" That was really tough to come up with, to be fair. But I think there is this mindset amongst workers in certain places, certain environments that they do have to pay for a job, and so I think that mindset shift needs to occur as well for this to be successful.
Thank you, Catherine. I think that's a really, really important point to reflect on, is the position of workers, the kinds of workers that we are talking about here. In the work that we've been doing over the last 8 years on labour migration, what we find is that for this sector of the Asian labour market, or maybe the global labour market, it's not the labour that is initially for sale. If we look at just demand and supply and economic trends, it's the job that is for sale. And I think this is really important, because if we're just looking at supply and demand economics, there are more workers wanting to find jobs than there are jobs for workers, especially when they are abroad. And if you look at the actual flow of the money if you look at the flow of the money, and I did a piece of research on this myself, which is looking at the flow of money between Nepal and Malaysia, and that money was not going in the direction that you think it should be going. So perhaps it's more than just mindset, it's actually the shape of the market. When a recruitment agency in an origin country has is trying to make money, they've already bonded with the government. They've got a bond for their license. It's not like any other business. A recruitment agency in Nepal or in any origin country is not like any other business. To get a business license, then they have to get another license just to be a recruitment agency, and they have to put all this money in a bond. And that's held by the government. And then, in order to make money, they've got to get contracts from the other countries, from the Gulf states or from Malaysia. They've got to get contracts. When that contract comes in for 100 workers or something like this, they've got about a month to get the workers. The workers, they're not even workers at this point. They're aspiring migrants. They're out in the rural areas. How are they supposed to go and advertise a job and supply the workers to the employer in the other country in 1 month? So they've got to have them on standby. So you've got to really think about it with the business mind. And there's more workers than jobs. So what happens? Simple economics. It's the job that's for sale. That's why workers see that they've got to pay for a job. So I think, and I'm not disagreeing, it's just what I've found in the market is that when we're talking about workers shouldn't have to pay, I think sometimes we are looking at I'm just going to be controversial and let's have a discussion. We're talking from a really idealistic standpoint. If I put my shoes in an aspiring migrant in rural Nepal or rural India, and I'm a granddaughter and a daughter of a migrant worker, my father, when he wanted to leave India, his passport was stolen by an agent because the agent wouldn't give his passport back because he wanted my father to go with his contract, And on the other side, my grandfather, he's also a migrant worker to the UK. So this kind of idea that of what should be the case, of what is ideal, is different from what is realistic. And I think we've really got to put our minds we've got to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody that's from a rural area of one of these countries that doesn't have access maybe to good jobs, isn't maybe as educated as they would have liked to have been. They've got their family's got enough money to send them abroad, but they're not really poor. They want a new experience. They want a good job, and they'll pay for that. And I think we've got to accept that they're willing to pay for it. Why is that so indigestible? Maybe it's just a question. I'm not saying I agree with it, but why is it so indigestible in the short term? All right.
Thanks, Arti. And on that note, I'll maybe turn to some of the questions that some of you have submitted online, and then I'll also take 1 or 2 questions from the floor. While I read out the questions online, you can have a think if anyone would like to raise their hand for a question from the floor. But I'll read out a few of these. The first one, perhaps a spicy one to begin with, is, are brands ready to accept that they need to pay the costs of recruitment and make the necessary investments to make sure that that's the case? Another question here asking about, have we done, or is there any data to look at the long-term return on investment for suppliers from making that investment in ethical recruitment to demonstrate, that there is a business case for this? And perhaps thirdly, from the online questions, how can businesses effectively engage with government to actually incentivize government to regulate towards making recruitment more effective and less expensive, instead of perhaps some of the other objectives of labor migration governance? So perhaps just to reflect on any of those from the panel, and perhaps I'll take any from the floor if anyone else wants to add anything. Sorry, over here, yes.
This has been really, really interesting, so thank you all. I guess I just wonder, now that we have some fairly strict legislation like the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, is there room for gradual progression without it being punitive? And is there room for collaboration from the legislation? I'm not sure. And so the pressure on brands now to move things so quickly without that real partnership and collaboration that Rachel was referring to is it's real pressure. So does that room exist? I'm not sure.
Thank you. So if anyone would like to take any of those 4 questions, and then we'll take some more if there's time.
I'm happy to kick off. I'm happy to start with the spicy one. I think it's a fabulous question. I think it's something that will necessarily have to form one of the pillars of the marketplace. I think my call out would be, though, we have to be thinking about shared costs. It is not on anyone to own the costs in the supply chain, and so I think maybe my spicy response is that it is not for brands to pay all of that cost. And I think, in fairness, and maybe I'll give you an example of what we see, just so I can share the sentiment that there is always 2 sides to a story, and the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. Throughout the course of the last year, we had some sort of price increase proposals from suppliers in Malaysia, or a supplier in Malaysia, who we since found out was trying to pass off the cost of wage increases at the full rate to every single one of their customers. And so when you find circumstances like that happening and you see that there's actually not that good faith in the system, that there are some who are trying to apportion all costs for recruitment all the way to one particular brand or one particular actor and not share the costs. I think that would be my quite important response in terms of the marketplace looking at frameworks. And because I think the other obvious call out is none of us can talk about pricing. From a brand perspective, it is really important that we look at building frameworks and consensus and potentially algorithms and toolkits that we can all look to use for things like ring fencing labour costing. But there will always be that role for competition in the environment. And so even within the marketplace, as we progress, making sure that we are always getting legal advice, competition advice in terms of the way we are looking to frame things. But I think just really important to point out that it has to be shared cost. It is not on any single person in the supply chain to be the answer to everything. And then I love your question. I think it is tricky. I think there is a lot of pressure on businesses to always get it right. And I think there has to be a little bit of wiggle room for this is hard and it's complex. And I keep saying it, but no one has all the answers. If we did, we would not be here talking about this issue. We would not have been talking about it for the last 10, 20 years. I think just a little bit of pragmatism and it's sort of the message of the day, but collaboration, we're all in it together. The only way any of us are going to solve it is that really genuine, authentic collaboration, understanding the patterns and the challenges that are in supply chains. I think too often we gloss over what's really happening in a supply chain. When you move away from your direct suppliers into that next layer and that next layer and that next layer, just unraveling that and actually understanding what's truly happening, I think being able to have a conversation about that would be a really healthy next step for any of us to actually solve some of these challenges.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. And just sorry if I can also speak to your question, which is something very close to my heart. Rachel mentioned earlier that she sits on the Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group advising the Australian Government on the operation of the Act. I do as well, but obviously coming at it from quite a different perspective. That the Act has been in place since 2018, and it was supposed to engender a race to the top as businesses reported on what they were doing to actually look for and remediate cases of modern slavery in their supply chain. Woolworths has been one of the very few companies to actually declare that they have found and remediated a case. Rio Tinto is another organisation who recently has. but those examples are very few and far between. So 7 years after that act was actually put in place, I would say it's pretty clear now it's not doing what it was supposed to do, with some very, very unusual exceptions, of which you've got one speaking to you today. So right now that act is under review by the government. My professional opinion is that the Australian government very much needs to institute a human rights due diligence obligation, either as part of the act or as a standalone obligation. We have some amazing examples of this coming through in the region. Thailand has its draft law. South Korea has a law on the table at the moment. Other countries in the region are looking at bringing in a human rights due diligence obligation. So to me, Australia used to, be leading the pack in that legislative space. I think our crown has slipped now, and I think there is a lot happening in Asia that we could maybe take some education from. So I really appreciate your question. I'm not sure if that's the answer you're looking for. I actually think that perhaps businesses maybe need a little bit more pressure rather than less.
Just to add maybe a new dimension. How do we incentivize ethical recruitment? I really like the term ethical recruitment because it sounds wholesome, it sounds nice, it sounds much better than modern slavery, it sounds much better than forced labour. I've been living and working in Southeast Asia for 18 years, and when before working in business and human rights, I used to work on what used to be called, brace yourself, child sex tourism. And, it was a term that was used sensationally in other countries to talk about child exploitation in Asia. But if we had to talk to the government about it and we had to translate it into Thai or Vietnamese, honestly, their face would screw up and they were like, what's that? So one of the ways of incentivizing is to really make it sound good. So what are we incentivizing? If we're going into a supply chain in India or in Indonesia, you really don't want to go in talking about modern slavery to Indian supply chain businesses. They're just not going to, it's just unheard of. What they want to hear about is safe labour. How are you going to take care of their resources, which is their labour? We need safe labour incentivization. And the other thing I want to add into the mix is that we're talking about APAC, Asia Pacific. This region, the economies are growing at some of the fastest growing economies in the world. What this means for the masses is in the last 20 years, universal access to healthcare, universal access to education for children. We're sitting in Bangkok, just look at Thailand. The demographics change as well. People are having less children. But what you're finding is that people are getting access to social security, pension funds. What that means is that workers need to be formalized in supply chains. So when we're incentivizing supply chains for ethical recruitment and safe labor standards, the incentivization is also contextualized in the development trajectory of these countries, which is moving very fast. If we're talking about India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, workers need to be protected in their own funds and all of this. So I just want to add that into the mix and to call it something that everybody wants to be a part of. Safe labor, freedom, protection. These are the kinds of words I think you should be using to incentivize. So let's also look at our language. Thank you.
Thanks, Arti. And I think maybe just to respond to the question from online around the return on investment for ethical recruitment, this is something else that we're looking at within the marketplace, is something that we're going to be studying, because obviously there is a theory that if you make those upfront investments in covering the full costs of workers' recruitment, doing the monitoring, doing the due diligence, investing in decent work and labor conditions that in the long run, your worker retention will increase, the rates of absconding may go down, you can keep workers longer so you don't have to re-recruit, you don't have to do recruitment fee remediation, perhaps you are subject to fewer and less frequent audits, you can perhaps charge a premium to suppliers, to customers for your product. And that's not just true for suppliers, it's also true of labor agencies as well. The idea that labor agencies can compete on a quality rather than a price basis as trusted partners. But a lot of that remains to be tested, right? And so in order to drive the market forward, to demonstrate this business case, we need to have that robust data and that robust, those metrics to demonstrate, that this theory about what we often talk about is actually true. And it's true to people that really understand numbers and returns on investment. Fuzz, I saw a question from you.
Thank you. We're in a crisis situation as the theme for the forum this year. Certainly recognises crises are really good because in a crisis you've got to actually do something. So I think that is an opportunity there, and Artie, completely agree with you on the language that we use. But there also is the process. We're in a new situation that we've never had before in human history, with the amount of migration, the amount of foreign workers shifting across, and particularly in medium economies, of which Thailand and Malaysia is becoming, with poorer economies around it. The whole area of ethical recruitment in this becomes essential. But the question comes, not should we have it, but what's the just transition into having it? Certainly in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, we argued, as we have with the EU, don't bring it all in at once, stage it in, so that we learn along the way to do that. So what does a just transition look like in bringing in ethical recruitment?
Thanks, Fuzz. I would invite everyone, if they would like to respond to that, and also add any concluding remarks, as we're just coming up to time.
Great question. First of all, we have to agree how long the just transition should be. I would say minimum 10 years. If we're looking at really bringing in an ethical marketplace and we want to make a real dent in the Asian APAC labour market, I think we need to work on a 10-year basis. And if we're looking at specific suppliers, I would have these kinds of indicators. In the first year, you will earn a premium on your goods if you have a policy on ethical recruitment with an intended commitment, a commitment that you're going to move. By year 2, you've actually gone and gathered all of your data. By year 3, you've reviewed all of your recruitment processes, contracts with ethical recruitment agencies, and started to have conversations and setting minimum standards for recruitment processes. By year 4 and 5, you've got a fantastic post-arrival pre-departure orientation, you've got really good contracting standards, and you're already increasing the amount of fees that you're paying to your ethical recruitment agency for better recruitment. And by this time, you've got worker voice, you've got worker representation. This is now going into 6 years. And you can bring in more and more iterative standards. The standard is getting better, it's getting better. And at the same time, you're influxing, you're injecting with capacity development and other resources. By year 10, you've got a really good recruitment process, and you've got a good grievance mechanism, you have good accommodation for workers, you have a good returning home policy and skills development. Really listening to what workers want as well. And you've got a really good relationship between employers and workers. That can be incentivized by buyers supporting through money and other kind of conditional price increases and payment terms. Thank you.
I love hearing Artie's pragmatic take on the world. I come from the NGO world, we're probably a bit more aspirational. So I would just say I truly believe I understand all of the steps you've outlined are critical to success. I just think that with greater collaboration, we can speed up that timeline, particularly collaboration, not just between businesses, but that is, an absolutely necessary part of the process, but between businesses and governments as well. And I think it simply is by working together that that we can really scale this concept of an ethical recruitment marketplace and genuinely make a difference to workers' lives. Thanks.
And maybe that's probably a perfect segue, because Catherine, I think that would be one of my closing remarks. I think just the power of collaboration. I think for me, the really key standouts, from a business perspective at least, are we really are at the limitations of being able to have impact on our own. I think we need to move away from the idea of remediation and actually look to what are the grassroots drivers in supply chains, look for patterns, look for the overarching solutions rather than the just sort of whack-a-mole of trying to solve something when you find it. What are the systemic changes, which is what we're trying to do with the marketplace. I think the recognition that for many of us, we do exist in very globalized, very interconnected supply chains. There is very rarely one supplier who is solely a Woolworths Group supplier. More often, they are a supplier to many hundreds of brands. So I think back to this idea of we are at the limitations of impact on our own, we also need to come together to collaborate to lift the tide, because we really are only as strong as the weakest link in an interconnected, globalized supply chain. And then also just this thought that we've had throughout the discussion, for many of the bigger brands, we have similar programs, similar commitments, but we're doing them quite differently. And so we recognize that that builds compliance burden, it builds complexity in the supply chain. So how do we work together to simplify? And when we can simplify, how do we then bring scale to actually start having impact, to really trying to solve? So that healthy mix of aspiration with pragmatism. But I do genuinely think that we can only do that through collaboration.
And what a note to end on. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you to all of our panelists for their time on today's session. Thank you very much.